So good afternoon, and great to see so many people in a poetry event. That's kind of always exciting. The event today is organized by the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, and thank you, Eva and Shana, which I'm not sure is here right now, but we're really grateful for everything. It is co-sponsored by the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies and the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. And so thank you, Monica, on behalf of all of us from the department and others. And maybe I will start with something that Bertolt Brecht famously said, and maybe all of you know. It goes something like this: in the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. Brecht's quote opens Hannah Eisenman's review of Daniel Borzutsky's poetry collection, written after a massacre in the year 2018, referring to the shooting in the Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue. Eisman writes that during dark times, all anyone can talk about is the dark times. And it's hard to say anything original or useful. Talk becomes strictly or else cynical. And basically he says that in dark times, all we get are cliches that makes us all fall asleep. Well, I think we are in dark times now, and I would like to say that this really does not happen to me in Kaminsky's work. Ilya Kaminsky's poems have the power to awaken the readers. Some of his lines touch our humanity in a way that provides a momentary comfort or relief, at least for me. But Ilya Kaminsky's poetry does not leave us in this comfortable place. It really does not let us ignore that, and I quote, "We lived happily during the war, and when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough." It is a great honor for us to host Kaminsky here this afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. This event is part of our poem poetry worlds class, and tomorrow Kaminsky will be meeting the students in the class. It is also our Jewish Community Federation Endowment Fund annual lecture. And in my 22 years here at the Taube Center, I think I can count on one hand the times that we had poets invited to be in these endowed lectures. And I hope that this marks a new beginning, where we have a focus on poetry, we have a focus on the short story, we have a competition, and we have a class, and so maybe this is the moment for poetry too. And I wish Charlotta von Robert, the director, was here to hear that. So, but she'll see the recording. I'd like to introduce Shoshana Olidort and then Ilya Kaminsky. Shoshana doesn't need really an introduction here, but still, Shoshana is a scholar of modern and contemporary Jewish women's poetry across English, Hebrew, and Yiddish. Her dissertation, which she wrote here at Stanford, is entitled "Performing Intersectional Identities for Jewish Women Poets in the 20th Century." And it explores the relationship between language and identity, and argues that modern poetry can be a mode of identity performance, particularly for those on the margins. Her project focuses on 4 Jewish women poets writing in Hebrew and English in the 20th century: Gertrude Stein, Esther Rab, Adrienne Rich, and Zelda Schneerson. The work considers things like surface and grammar, as well as prayer and politics, to show how from their respective positions at the intersection of multiple margins, as women and Jews, some of them queer, some immigrants, these writers manipulate poetic form to assert alternative identities. So I hope that's enough to kind of get you interested in her work, and we look forward to the book. Shoshana. Shoshana is also a web editor for the Chicago-based Poetry Foundation. She is a critic, a writer, and a translator, and her work has appeared in the Times Literary Supplement, the New Republic, the Paris Review Daily, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Jewish Review of Books, and maybe I forgot a few places, but yeah, lots of publications. Welcome back to Stanford, and thank you so much for joining us. I think that you will always, I hope you will always be part of our intellectual community here, and so it's natural for us to just see you here in interviewing. Thank you, and welcome to our guest poet. Ilya Kaminsky has also ties to this area. He worked as a law clerk for San Francisco Legal Aid and the National Immigration Law Center. More recently, he worked pro bono as the court-appointed special advocate for orphan children in Southern California, and currently he holds the Burnack Chair in Poetry at Georgia Institute of Technology and lives in Atlanta. He's here mostly as a poet, and a poet that was born in Odessa and then the Soviet Union, and moved to the United States in 1993. The author of Death Republic, right here, and Dancing in Odessa, and co-editor and co-translator of many other books, including Echo Anthology of International Poetry and Dark Elderberry Branch Poems of Marina Tsvetlana. His work was translated to many languages. He won the Los Angeles Times Book Award, the National Jewish Book Award, the Guggenheim Fellowship, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award, Lannan Fellowship, Academy of American Poets Fellowship, a Poetry Magazine Prize, the T.S. Eliot Prize in the UK. Well, this is not the entire list. Maybe I'll just add something about Death Republic, that was the New York Times notable book for 2019, and was also named the best book of 2018 by a dozen other publications, including Washington Post, Times Literary Supplement, The Telegraph, Publishers Weekly, The Guardian, Irish Times, Vanity Fair, and New Statesman, and more. Last spring, Ilya Kaminsky's poem Gunshot was at the center of one of our encounters with the lyric form panels here at Stanford. And I really encourage you all to check out Professor Lucy Alfred's reading of it. It was the first step to now having him here with us. You're all here, I assume, because you know and love his poetry. So I'll stop here, and we'll let you start the conversation. But first, please help me welcome Shoshana and Ilya.
We were wondering what we're going to do, and since we don't know what we're going to do, we figured maybe just share some poems. Since they're already written, so it's easy. But I hope it is going to be a conversation between us, because I have a lot to learn, and also between other in the room. So it's not just us speaking to you, but all of us speaking. I hope that would probably be the most productive. But having said that, I'm just going to read you some poems. I believe you all have a handout. These are poems from the Republic, okay? Yeah. And I read poems from a chair, so that's going to be a new experience. Thank you all for being here today. We live it happily during the war. We live it happily during the war. And when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed, around my bed, America was falling. Invisible house, by invisible house, by invisible house. I took a chair outside and watched the sun. In the 6th month of a disastrous reign, in a house of money, in a street of money, in a city of money, in a country of money, our great country of money. We forgive us, live it happily during the war. The Republic. Gunshot. Gunshot. Our country is a stage. When soldiers march into town, public assemblies are officially prohibited. But today, the neighbors flock to the piano music from Sonia and Alfonso's puppet show in Central Square. Some of us have climbed up into trees, others hide behind benches and telegraph posts. When Petya, the deaf boy in the front row, sneezes, the sergeant puppet collapses, shrieking. He stands up again, snorts, shakes his fist at the laughing audience. An army jeep swerves into the square, disgorging its own. Sergeant, disperse immediately! Disperse immediately. The puppet mimics in a wooden falsetto. Everyone freezes except Petya, who keeps giggling. Someone claps a hand over his mouth. The sergeant turns out towards the boy, raising his finger. You! The puppet raises a finger. Sonia watches her puppet. The puppet watches the sergeant watches Sonia and Alfonso. But the rest of us watch Petya lean back, gather all the speed in his throat and launch it at the sergeant. The sound we do not hear leaves the gulfs of the water. A soldier's march. Alfonso covered the boy's face with a newspaper. 14 people, most of us strangers, watch Sonia kneel by Petya, shot in the middle of the street. She picks up his spectacles, shining like 2 coins, balances them on his nose. Observe this moment, how it convulses. Snow falls on the docks, run into the streets like medics fighting hours watch. Sonia kisses his forehead, her shot a hole torn in the sky. It shimmers the park benches, porch lights we see. In Sonia's open mouth, the nakedness of the whole nation. She stretches out beside the little snowman napping in the middle of the street. Speaking up, its belly, the country wants. Alfonso, in snow. You're alive, I whispered to myself. Therefore, something in you listens. Something runs down the street, falls, fails to get up, I run, etc. With my legs and my hands behind my pregnant wife, etc. Down Wasenka Street, I ran, etc. It takes only a few minutes, etc. to make a man. Darkness and insurgency begins. Our country woke up next morning and refused to hear soldiers. In the name of Petya, we refused. At 6 a.m., when soldiers compliment the girls in the alleyway, the girls slide by pointing to their ears. At 8, the bakery door is shut and soldiers see Ivana's face, though he's their best customer. At 10, Mama Galia shouts, "No one hears you!" on the gates of the soldiers' barracks. By 11 a.m., arrests begin. Our hearing does not weaken, but something silent in us strengthens. After curfew, families have their arrested and homemade puppets out of their windows. The streets empty, but for the squeaks of strings and the tap-tap against the building of wooden fists and feet in the ears of the town. Snow falls. Alfonso stands answerable. My people, you were really something fucking fun on the morning of the first arrest. Our men once frightened and bound to their beds now stand up like human mass. Darkness passes through us like a police. We still here as a night testify. Each of us comes home, shuts at the wall, at the stove, at the refrigerator, let himself. Forgive me. I wasn't honest with you. Life, to you I stand. Answerable. I ran, etc., with my legs in my hands, etc. I ran down the Western Street, etc., whoever listens. Thank you for the further end, my tongue. Thank you for our arguments that end. Thank you for deafness, Lord, such fire from a match you never lit. That map of bone and open it valves. I watched the sergeant there, the deaf boy, take iron and fire in his mouth, his face and the asphalt. That map of bone and open it valves. It is the air, something in the air wants us too much. The earth is still. The tower guards eat cucumbered sandwiches. This first day, soldiers examine the years of bartenders, account on soldiers. The wicked Zim silence dust to soldiers that tear Gore's wife from her bed like a door of a bus. Observe this moment, how it convulses. The body of the boy lies on the asphalt like a paper clip. The body of the boy lies on the asphalt like the body of a boy. I touch the walls, feel the pulse of the house, and I stare off wordless and do not know why I am alive. We tiptoe the city, Sonia and I, between zealots and guardians and wrought iron gates. Be courageous, we say, but no one is courageous. As a sound we do not hear live the birds of the water. Before the war, we made a child. I kissed a woman with freckles, rose, and neighbors. She had a mole on her shoulder, which she displayed like a medal for bravery. Her trembling lips might come to bed. Her hair, water-fallen, in the middle of the conversation, might come to bed. I walked in my barber shop of thoughts. Yes, I lifted her off to bed on the chair of my hairy arms. But parted lips, my parted lips lying under the couches, Sonia, the things we did. Soldiers came at us. Soldiers came at us. They fire as a crowd of women flee inside the nostrils of searchlights. My God, have a photograph of this. In the piazza's bright hair, soldiers drag Petya's body and his head among the stairs. I feel through my wife's shorts the shape of our child. Soldiers drag Petya up the stairs on homeless decks. Then, as philosophers understand everything and bark, I, now on the bridge, with no camouflage of speech, a body wrapped in the body of my pregnant wife. Tonight, if we don't die, and don't die, the earth is still. A helicopter I boast my wife. On earth, a man cannot flip a finger at the sky, because each man is already a finger flipped at the sky. Lullaby. Little daughter, rainwater, snow and branches protect you, whitewashed walls and neighbors' hands. Oh, child of my Aprils, little earth of 6 pounds, my white hair keeps you asleep, lit. While the child sleeps, Sonia undresses. She scrubs me, and she spits soapy water pig. She smiles. A man should smell better than his country. Such is the silence of a woman who speaks again. Silence known. That silence is what moves us to speak. She throws my shoes and glasses in the air. I'm of deaf people, and I have no country, but a bus stop and an infant and a marriage bed. Soaping together, that is sacred to us, washing each other's shoulders. You can fuck anyone, but with whom can you see it in water? Foyer bombardment. Foyer bombardment. My body runs in a Alum of street, my clothes in a pillowcase. I look for a man who looks exactly like me, to give him my Sonia, my name, my shirt. It has begun. Neighbors climb the trolleys at the fish market, break all the moments in half. Trolleys barks like contestants in the sun. Pavel shots, I am so fucking beautiful, I cannot stand it. 2 boys still holding tomato sandwiches, hopping in trolleys, slide soldiers same at their faces, their ears. I can't find my wife where I is my pregnant wife. I, a body, an adult male awaits to explode like a hand grenade. It has begun. I see the blue canary of my country, big breadcrumbs from each citizen's size, big breadcrumbs from my neighbor's hair. The snow leaves the earth and falls straight up as it should, to have a country so important, to run into walls, into streetlights, into loved ones, as one should. The blue canary of my country runs into walls, into streetlights, into loved ones. The blue canary of my country washes the legs as I run and fall. As you go out, watch. Vasinka citizens do not know. They are evidence of happiness. In a time of war, each is a repeated document of laughter. Watch, God, they have something to tell that not even they can hear. Climb a roof in a center square of this bombed out city. You will see one neighbor gives a cigarette, another gives a dog a pint of sunlit beer. You will find me, God, like a damn pigeon's beak I am packing every which way at astonishment. Firing squad. Firing squad. On balconies, sunlight. On poplars, sunlight. On our lips, today, no one is shooting. I go, cast her hair with imaginary scissors. The scissors in sunlight, her hair in sunlight. Another girl nicks a pair of shoes from a sleeping soldier's covered with light. A soldier's awake and gape at us, gaping at them. What do they see? Tonight, they shot 50 women at Lerner Street. I sit down to write and tell you what I know. A child learns the world by putting it in her mouth. A girl becomes a woman, and a woman earned body. They blame you for all things, and they seek in the body what doesn't live in the body. The townspeople watch them take Alfonso. Now, each of us is a witness stand. Vasenka, watch us. Watch for soldiers throw Alfonso Barabinski on the sidewalk. We let them take him. All of us, cowards. What we don't say, we carry in our suitcases, our coat pockets, our nostrils. Across the street they watch him with fire hoses. First he screams, then he stops. So much sunlight, a t-shirt falls off a clothesline, and an old man stops, picks it up, presses it to his face. Neighbors line up to watch him thrown on the sidewalk like a vaudeville act. Ta-da! In so much sunlight, each of us is a witness stand. They take Alfonso, and no one stands up. Our silence stands up for us. Okay, one more poem and then I'll be out of your hair, okay? This one is going to bring it much closer home. It's called In a Time of Peace. In a Time of Peace. Inhabitant of Earth for 40-something years, I once found myself in a peaceful country. I watched the neighbors open their phones to watch a cop demanding a man's driver license. And when a man reaches for his wallet, the cop shoots into the car window. Shoots. It's a peaceful country. We pocket our phones and go to the dentist to pick up the children from school to buy shampoo and basil. Ours is a country in which a boy shot by police lies on a pavement. For us, we see in his open mouth the nakedness of the home nature. We watch others, watch. The body of a boy lies on the pavement exactly like the body of a boy. It is a peaceful country, and it clips our citizens' bodies effortlessly, the way the president's wife trims her toenails. All of us still have to do the hard work of dentist appointments, of remembering to make a summer salad, basil, tomatoes. It is a joy, tomatoes, and a little salt. This is a time of peace. I don't hear gunshots, but watch birds splash over the backyards of the suburbs. How bright is the sky as the avenue spins on its axis. How bright is the sky? Forgive me. How bright?
Thank you so much, Ilya. That was such a beautiful reading. I'm blown away, I think, just by the performance of it, too. So musical and really moving. And I'm thinking of the sunlit sky that we we were looking at as we walked down Palm Drive towards campus, and thinking also of the line, let the silence not stand up for us, or the silence does stand up. And just, I guess, want to say, like, I'm feeling gratitude to you for not letting silence stand up and for speaking out in this way that you do. And I want to sort of bring into the conversation current events, because I think part of the impetus for this reading here today is what's going on in Ukraine. And because of your own work at the intersection of poetry and activism, I wanted to ask you if you can talk a little bit about how your work is informed by your activism, your work as a poet is informed by your activism, and how your activism is also shaped by your poetry. So how they speak to each other.
Okay, thank you for this question. I would never call myself an activist. I don't really know what activist means. I'm a human being. You do what you can. There was a poet in California, you wrote a book about him. Day draws near, another one. Do what you can. That's me, Yosh. What else can you say on the subject? You all come out of your lives, out of your experiences, out of your histories, and they inform who you are as a human. Those may be the books you've written or the stories you live in. But everybody is an activist in one way or another. You may be an activist who's asleep, but you breathe, and that's an act. So I would never want to call myself, because it's not an acting kind of activity. You just live your life, and what else can you do if you want to talk about Ukraine, which I suppose you want to talk about? My family lives in Ukraine, so what am I supposed to do? Be asleep? You know. It is a very complicated country to begin with. There's a really good reason why my family doesn't live in Ukraine anymore. We happen to be Jewish. But complicated countries have a right to be independent. Civilians in complicated countries have a right not to be bombed. So I come from that perspective. And you try to raise money, or you try to translate testimonies, because that's what you can do. I think I can do a lot more than I've done, as a matter of fact. So I am a failed activist. Poetry comes from that perspective very much so, because a lyric poet is a creature of emotions. More so, it's a creature of senses. A creature who tries to make sense of senses and fails. Because Kafka, dear old Kafka, told us that language is but a poor translation. And that is every poet's job description, to translate better from life into language, or from silence into language, or from language into language, or from failure of language into a better failure of language. Fail, fail again, fail better, that is Beckett, right? So if you are trying to separate your act of breathing from your act of writing, then you're probably not writing.
Thank you. I mean, you mentioned translation, and that's something you're very involved in, so I'm wondering
So
if
are
you... Well, not to the same degree, and I'm not translating from Russian and Ukrainian. I'm wondering if you can share with us a little bit about your current work in translating contemporary Ukrainian poets.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm actually mostly translating testimonies at this moment, because in some ways they have a great deal more poetry in them. Simply because most of you in this room who are writing know how unreliable writing can be. You may be so passionate at night, when you wake up in the morning and you look at that paper and think, who the hell wrote that? You know. Whereas taking a testimony from a fellow human, you recognize images that you're moved by. And if you are moved by them, another fellow human is likely to move it by them if you conduct yourself with precision. Precision is very crucial word in the act of writing. So the testimonies is what I'm trying to translate most right now, mostly from the refugees who are in Odessa, because Odessa has not been as impacted as other parts of the country. And so it's flooded with folks from Nikolaev, which is only about an hour away, which is devastated. People don't have water there. It's continually bombed. It is flooded by people from Kherson, which is occupied, by Kharkov, which is continually bombed, and so forth. And those are all Russian-speaking areas of the country. And Putin, of course, is claiming to bomb Russian-speaking people in order to protect Russian language. And so they flood to a city like Odessa, where they can speak their native language and feel a little more protected. Now, Odessa is still bombed, maybe not every hour, but definitely every week, unfortunately. The street where my uncle lives, a couple of blocks away, has been bombed. The cemetery where my grandmother is buried has been bombed. So it's all very real, which is why I do translation of that specific language. But of course, there are poets who are writing. Dmitry Bliznyuk is a poet who lives in Kharkov right now, and he's writing poems during the Blitz. And you ask him, how do you do it? And he says, you hide for a little bit, and then you go back to editing your poems. That's his response, literally. There are other poets, there are poets who left Bucha, and then come back to find little explosive devices in children's slippers. Somebody literally put an explosive device into the child's slipper. There is a poet from Bucha who left. Bucha used to be a well-to-do town. Doctors and lawyers lived there. So many people had the means to live. Now she come back, and because he had the means, he had the house checked. The house had an enormous amount of radiation there. The question was why? Why would a house in the middle of Bucha, so far from Chernobyl, have radiation in it? The Russian soldiers, probably 17-year-old boys who were born decade after Chernobyl happened, passing through Chernobyl, coming from Belarus, they have no idea what Chernobyl is. They marched all the way to Bucha. They stayed at that house. Now the house is uninhabitable because of how much radiation the soldiers carried on their body. Just think about that. How do you explain that? It's, in itself, it's a real metaphor. The house in the middle of a country that has so much radiation. There's a soldier literally voting across the country that carries so much radiation. And his own person to render the house where he stayed uninhabitable. So these are the kind of testimonies. But of course there are also poems. There are wonderful poets at work. I don't really do a lot of books. I try to do some poems from this person, some poems from that person, because there's so many people. And believe it or not, to be published in a magazine, in a poetry magazine in the United States, is a big deal for people who don't live in the United States. So you try to help. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you're doing, translating these testimonies.
I really don't want to portray it as a work because it's not work. You just live your life, you know.
Right. Yeah, I hear you. I want to come back to the book. So it's set in the fictional town of Vasenka, which is under occupation, right? And of course, the book was released in 2019. And if I'm not mistaken, the poems were written over the course of a decade or more before that, right? So well before the current war in Ukraine. But reading it, it's really hard not to see it as speaking to the events that are unfolding right now. And I couldn't help thinking of the idea of poetry as prophetic and the poet as a kind of prophet. I'd love to hear your thoughts about sort of that conversation between poetry and prophecy. But I also want to know more specifically whether and to what extent were you responding to, in this book, to the Russian invasion of Crimea at the time in 2014, which was, of course, a precursor to what's going on right now.
You know, are there any people from Crete who write in here? No, alas. Any people who write poems? Great, terrific, yay. Go read some Isaiah, since, you know, it's Jewish studies and all that. There's a lot of stuff that's very relevant. So I don't really think of myself in the department of prophets. Isaiah was more than enough for us to handle. What I would say is, number one, the war has been going on for a long time, since at least 2014. My life, after Soviet Union fell apart, during the fall apart of the Soviet Union, as a matter of fact, 2 hours from Odessa is a region of Prydnestrovia. Prydnestrovia is Transnistria in English. That was the very first of Russian Federation's humanitarian aid campaigns, meaning people were bombed, high schools were bombed. So we got a lot of refugees in Odessa in the 1990s, early 1990s. People would just knock on our door, and I was a kid, I was 15. In the middle of the night, there was a guy in pajamas, just to give you a story. And he was yelling, hey, I helped you to carry a refrigerator from Prydnestrovia that you bought 2 years ago. Remember me? I need to make a phone call. So these are very similar situations. There was busloads of people coming out, and the market at Odessa has a really well-known in Eastern Europe, one of the largest in Eastern Europe, food markets called Privoz. People from all over come to sell their fruits and veggies. And so there were busloads of people who were refugees coming in, and I remember these farmers who didn't really speak Ukrainian or Russian. They spoke Surchik, which is a combination, even free food to refugees. And refugees were just coming off the buses, you know. So that was 1990s, so way before the crisis in Donbass began in 2014. So those images come from that. And of course, in that part of the world, the war really never really ends. My grandmother was born in 1918. When she was born, Odessa was occupied by Greece, by France, by a few other countries. Literally, the city was divided between different nations, and you went to visit your sister or your brother next block, and you were across the border. So that is those are the stories you grow up with. I was a deaf child growing up. That's the perfect thing to end on.
You were in the middle of saying something. Did you?
Yeah, can you hear me though?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so, well, I was a deaf kid growing up, meaning I didn't have hearing aids in USSR. So my native language is lip reading. But what happens when you're lip reading? It means you and I are having a conversation in the middle of the street. I'm reading your lips, but if you are in a place like Odessa, above you is a balcony, and somebody is talking to somebody else on the other street, shouting at balconies. You know, somebody is trying to hail a cab. The cab stops, it's too expensive. So the person decides very loudly not to take a cab and walk. And you keep talking, but there's a cat walking by you, and the tail is shivering. And all of that is a part of your syntax. All of that is what a lip reader is watching when your sentence is being delivered. So in my poems, the main literary device is an image. This is what my poems are mostly made out of. But that comes from childhood. Another poet who is from around here, Louise Gleig, what does she say in a poem called Nostos? What does one expect of a lyric poet? We look at the world once in childhood. The rest is memory. Of course, nobody tells you when the childhood ends.
That's very beautiful. Thank you. So I wanted to ask you, at the very beginning of the book, Petya, the deaf boy, resists a soldier's orders and is shot dead, right? And in protest, the townspeople choose deafness. And in the poem Checkpoints, we read, and I'm quoting, "In these avenues, deafness is our only barricade." I wanted to ask if you can talk about what it means to choose deafness, specifically as a mode of resistance.
Mm-hmm. I will have to cross over a little bit from Jewish studies into disability studies, so bear with me. There is the classic of disability studies. Also lives in San Francisco. Everybody lives in San Francisco. Rosemary Garland Thompson, who says something like, disability should move from the realm of the hospital room into the realm of political minority. And that is very real. Like right now, the pandemic is still going on. Some of you are wearing masks. I should be wearing a mask. So it's very real. It wasn't real when she wrote it in her book called Extraordinary Bodies back in the 1990s. I just took a class on. So that was at that time, of course, a great novel came out by Saramago called Blindness. A book about blind people becoming a giant community and all the political situations that were happening at the same time. It's a great book. He won a Nobel Prize, all that. It was heavily criticized in disability communities because blindness was used as a negative. And I thought, oh, well, okay, fine. Let's see what we can do about it. And at the same time, in disability studies, folks were saying, well, you can't really use disability as a metaphor because then you're appropriating and all that. And I was like, well, you're telling me that I can't use a metaphor? Seriously? The people were using metaphors for thousands of years, and suddenly I can't just because I'm disabled? Hello. And so what you try to do is you try to take these concepts and turn them on their heads and say, I'm going to use it as a positive metaphor. Everybody should be like a disabled person, as opposed to using disabled person as a metaphor. But of course, if you're a writer, you don't just write on slogans. You write about human beings. And human beings are a failed species. So the book begins with a positive protest. it doesn't end so well because it's about humans. But what I was trying to do is, okay, I'm going to take this as far as I can go and start by saying we protest with Daphnis and see what it tells me about human condition. Because what is the difference between literature and exercise? A writer sits down to write a book not just as another project, but because a writer has an impossible, unanswerable question. And the act of writing that book, the writer tries to ask every single poetic device the writer has, a line break, a metaphor, alliteration, assonance, everything in your possession you try to use to answer these impossible metaphysical questions. That does it.
Thank you. Yeah, this makes me want to ask you, what is the question you set out to wrestle with in this book?
Any metaphor is a child of two parents. We were talking about Amichai recently, right? So Yehuda Amichai, a great Hebrew poet, has this very famous metaphor. Forgive me, I'm going on a tangent, but I'll come back home, I promise. But it's useful. What are the obsessions, right? Well, let's look at it through the eye of actual poetic devices of craft. So I'm going to bring an example, after which I'll come back to the question. Yehuda Amichai has a famous metaphor. God's hand in this world is like my mother's hand inside the belly of a slaughtered chicken. Let me repeat it so everybody can laugh. God's hand in this world is like my mother's hand inside the belly of a slaughtered chicken. Now, you'll never forgive me. I gave you something gross and impossible to forget. But here is the question. What comes first, God or a chicken? The chicken always comes first. Because as a poet, you're grounded in particulars. But as a human being, you're grounded in obsessions. Homer may have told us, oh, sing to me, muse. But then Freud came around and Freud said, hey, you writers. You call it a muse, but it's really your obsession. Meaning, in Amichai's case, God. What is God? I don't know. Let's try a chicken. See where it gets me. And it got him to a wonderful metaphor, because it is impossible questions. It's all midrashic tradition. You keep asking questions with a question, right? So a poetic device here is literally made out of two parents, an image and abstraction. So in my work, every single metaphor will tell you about my obsession, the abstraction. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I'm just trying to go into the how part.
Right. No, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I wanted to come back to silence, since silence is a recurring motif in this book and in your exactly, and in your previous book also. And in addition to silence, there's wordlessness, there's speechlessness. Even in one of the poems you read today, Alfonso observes the convulsions of war and the dead Petya, and he says, the body of the boy that lies on the asphalt like a paperclip, the body of the boy that lies on the asphalt like the body of a boy. And the simile falls flat, of course, and Alfonso steers up wordless. In Soldiers Aim at Us, Alfonso finds himself with, and I quote again something you read today, with no camouflage of speech, as if he's caught stark naked, defenseless, ashamed. And even when the baby that Alfonso and Sonia are expecting arrives, the nursery is filled with an eerie noiselessness, as, and I'm quoting, quiet hisses like a match dropped in water. And in three poems that are dispersed, extremely short poems titled Question, so I guess this is the question, interspersed throughout the collection, we learn that a human being is, and I'm quoting again, a quiet between two bombardments. But silence is also what compels speech. As Sonia puts it, and I'm quoting, silence is a stick I beat you with. I beat you with a stick voice. Beat you until you speak right. And in another poem, we learn of a woman who speaks against silence, knowing silence moves us to speak. Silence declares the speaker is something of the sky in us. And of course, in the notes at the very end of the book, we read, the deaf don't believe in silence. Silence is the invention of the hearing. And that's such a powerful closing line. I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that note and about silence itself, which is, as I mentioned, a motif also in your earlier book.
Thank you. Let's unpack it a little bit. Put it in the text, it's no longer silence. Silence is an invention of the hearing. How do we look at that? What is silence? Coming more or less, being more or less a product of Western civilization, for better or worse, I have to ask, what does it mean, the word silence? And very quickly you realize that it's like an umbrella, like a giant metaphor that is trying to cover too many things. It's like one umbrella you put in the center of this room trying to keep all of us from the rain. And of course it doesn't quite work, it falls apart. But what do I mean when I say it's an umbrella that's trying to do too many things? What do I mean when I say it's a metaphor? Well, Western civilization at a minimum, you have theology, you have metaphysics use the word silence. The people write the whole books on the concept of silence of God is God. There are so many disciplines that put silence in the center of conversation. But wait a second, what does it mean if 8% of people in the world, and that is the number of deaf or hard of hearing people on the planet, do not believe in the concept? It doesn't exist in their daily experience. What does it tell us about our theology, our philosophy, our metaphysics? The limitations. But there are many other things one can consider. As we mentioned it, the silence of people who are silenced as a verb, the silence of people who keep quiet while watching others being silenced. You're familiar with that, you live in a time of political crisis. But you also need to survive in a time of political crisis, which is why you're hopefully in love. And if you're in love, I recommend it. If you're in love, you have a person with whom you don't need language. A true understanding is always silence. You may copy over the language of just looking at each other and saying, You get it, right? So there's so many parts of our human experience in which the limitation of language can be wonderful or horrific, depending on how we live. And the book is trying to unpack it in one way or another. And that is not an uncommon thing. You know that as a scholar of Jewish-Ukrainian, who is a great lover and hater of silence. She could never shut up, God bless her. But she could never say it in English because her native language was Yiddish. People tend to forget that. And because she was growing up watching English as architecture made into music. And you may or may not know what it means. And so you watch and see people's lips move. And then they stop, and then they move again, and then they stop, and then they move at a much higher speed, and then they stop for a longer silence. And you're just watching. And it's musical. It's like when you go to an orchestra, a symphony, opera, and before that, somebody sings. And you understand the words, and it's so moving you're crying. And then the opera begins. Nobody sings. It's just music, and you're crying. You see what I'm saying? The information doesn't need, the poetry doesn't need to be information. poetry doesn't need to be about an event. It is an event in of itself. You don't need to know the words in order to be moved. And that is a great secret the Church of Stanford shared with us.
Well, I think you shared it with us today too. In the way in your performance, I very much thought that the architecture of music was so beautiful, that sort of image, and I think it came through in your poetry. I wanted to maybe slightly shift the conversation to talk about humor. You know, in many ways, this is a tragic story, but it's not without humor, dark humor, which finds expression in curses like the one from Of Weddings Before the War. May you win the lottery and spend it all on doctors. I love that. And in A Cigarette, we learned that the unwitting Vasenka citizens are, and I'm quoting, evidence of happiness, each a ripped-out document of laughter. And while the speaker addresses God saying, watch God, the deaf have something to tell that not even they can hear. We learn of neighbors thieving cigarettes and giving a dog a pint of beer before the speaker turns to God again saying, you will find me, God, like a dumb pigeon's beak. I am pecking every which way at astonishment. I wanted to ask you how you strike that balance between humor and pathos in these poems that are addressing issues of such urgency.
Well, it would be very boring to live otherwise. That would be the first response. I come from the city of Odessa, which in the time of USSR was known as USSR's capital of humor, which is something to be a very boring empire's capital of humor. To good and bad, who knows? But it was. April 1, the Fool's Day, was in my lifetime, since mid-80s, much larger holiday than, say, Christmas in Odessa. There would be dozens of thousands of people in the street dressed up like clowns, telling jokes to each other. One thing that's very different between April the Fool Day in the West and in Eastern Europe. In the West, it is when you make fun of someone. In the East, it's where you have fun together. That celebration of April 1st was very different from what I learned when I came to America. It is still the case now. Odessa is, for me now, having lived in America for so long, I came here in '93 when I was 16, that kind of ha-ha is complicated for me. I was there this summer, as I was telling you, we're sitting in a restaurant, there is an air raid. People continue to make jokes. Now, if I kept living in Odessa, I would have probably been proud of that kind of stamina. If I have lived in America only, looking at it, I would have probably called it bravery. But because I come from Odessa and I come back to it almost every summer, I call it worrisome. Why do I call it worrisome? Because I think it's important for human beings to grieve too. We can't just laugh in the face of disaster as a full-time job. At some point, it stops being fun. However, I do come from that world. It's very Jewish world. It's very Yiddish world, I should say. Odessa was, except for Warsaw, the largest Jewish Yiddish-speaking population in the Russian Empire, larger than Vilna, which was called Jerusalem of the North. Much of that was, of course, wiped out during the war, but even in my parents' lifetime, or when I was born in '77, over a third of city's population was still Jewish. Now it's less than 5%. So the language itself, the language structure, even though everybody spoke Russian, you know, there were Poles, there were Greeks, obviously Ukrainians, Russians, it's very different Russian from Russian in St. Petersburg or Moscow. And it is very fine language. People like, you can say a boring sentence, but how you say it would be really hilarious. And it is probably the only city in the world where comedians are national heroes. There's a writer, Mikhail Zhvanetsky, there are like 3 monuments for him in the city. There's a boulevard named after him, and he's a comedian. Just died recently. A wonderful writer. Of course, Isaac Babel is a national writer. There a monument for Babel was just in the last decade put up in Odessa, and the government refused to pay for it, so people gathered the money to pay for it. So it was put on by regular humans who clean streets, who work in factories, who go to supermarkets. They thought it's important enough to put up a monument for a humorous writer, Isaac Babel. Why? I'll tell you my answer. When I was a kid, I came home, I didn't care about writing, about poetry. Who cares? You're a kid. You want to smoke a cigarette. I saw a book open on the kitchen table. That was Isaac Babel's book. In that, I read a little bit and I thought, oh, that's how mom and dad speak. It's very different from how people on TV speak. It's fashion, but it's different. It's different how people in school speak. And I realized, oh, literature can be intimate. Literature can be a voice for solitude, family language. And I think a lot of people feel that way, which is why Isaac Babel got to have a monument.
Thank you. I was going to ask you about Isaac Babel and his influence on you, so I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to turn to God, because he's everywhere. God is everywhere in this book, and also nowhere.
You are if you don't talk about God.
And also nowhere, of course. In one poem, your speaker declares, at the trial of God, we will ask, why did you allow all this? And the answer will be an echo, why did you allow all this? Of course, your speaker is hardly the first person to ask such questions of God. There's almost a tradition of this, I want to say, that goes back to the Bible, of people wanting to put God on trial. But I'm maybe less interested in...
let's do it.
Yeah, less interested in God than in your relationship with God and faith and spirituality. Among your many projects is the phenomenal anthology, A God in the House, that you co-edited with Catherine Towler. And it features interviews with 20 different poets, about 20 poets that center on God and faith. One of those poets, the legendary Gerald Stern, who died just last week. And I wanted to share a quote from... Yeah.
Great poem.
Yeah. I wanted to share the quote from the interview that you included in your introduction to that book from Stern, in which he says, and I'm quoting, "Poets, maybe all artists, get away from their own religious upbringing in order to arrive at a condition of faith. As you and Towler explain, and I'm quoting, the condition of faith is essential to any artistic endeavor." So I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about your own condition of faith and about how it informs your poetry.
Thank you. I did not have a religious upbringing. I'm a completely culturally Jewish person. When I was growing up, you come to somebody's house, if they have Shalom Aleichem on the bookshelf, they're your people. If they don't, you watch what you're talking about. Because people who don't like Jews are not going to have Shalom Aleichem on their bookshelf. Okay. That's simple. And that applied to a lot of other culturally speaking things. It was a very limited world in terms of how much of your culture you can contain. Even though my grandmother, as I mentioned to you before in our conversation, native language was Yiddish. But like when neighbors came, my mom would hide matzah. But then again, it's cultural. God is more of an obsession. It's an impossible question. It's a longing. For me, midrash is not a religious thing so much as a metaphysical thing. By being a human being, if you're not familiar with the concept of midrash, it's the concept of continually revising the holy book over the generations and generations and generations. It's a, you can call it a literary tradition, you can call it a religious tradition, or you can call it breathing. But for me, that's one way of thinking that literature is not just pretty games with language. and justifying why do I spend all this time with line breaks when I have a law degree and can do far more useful things. Matter physics are useful. I may be foolish enough to say that, but so it's an obsession. Or to put it in another way, we talked about translation earlier. We can say that as a native this native speaker of a different language, I will say that translation is impossible, it is fiction. But we must do it, because without it, we don't have Torah in English or Bible in Russian, and so forth. You don't have Shakespeare in Ukrainian, and so forth. So translation is impossible, but you must do it. Same thing with faith. It's impossible, but if you don't have it, life is very boring.
So that's the condition of your faith that informs your poetry?
I think otherwise religion is a corporation, and I'm not very interested in corporations.
I can appreciate that. Thank you. I guess I want to close with the closing poem of the book that you read here, In a Time of Peace, which in some ways is the most difficult poem, I think, in the collection, at least for me reading it. It's very much, I think, directed at an American readership who might otherwise feel themselves or ourselves at some remove from the narrative that, that unfolds and seems to unfold someplace else, someplace, far away. But in this poem, which is located temporally in a time of peace, we are forced to look at our own circumstances in this peaceful country where we pocket our phones and go to the dentist to pick up the kids from school to buy shampoo and basil, while a boy shot by police lies on the pavement for hours, his open mouth revealing the nakedness of the whole nation. I won't keep quoting, it's such a beautiful poem. And in this time of peace, the speaker does not hear gunshots, even as the peaceful country clips our citizens' bodies effortlessly. It's such a powerful closing poem, and I want to say it comes not as a shock, but as a reminder of what you're talking about, that what you're talking about here is not a fiction, right? That it is the reality that's unfolding around us every day. And so I wanted to ask you, what does poetry, in the end, offer you, offer us, in a time of peace that is not at all peaceful, in a country and this world that is perpetually at war?
So, thank you for your questions, very beautiful questions. And thank you for reading so closely, I appreciate it. And thank you all for your patience in listening to me talk without a microphone, which is, thank you, I don't know how much of it was translated, but thank you for being here. I'm gonna close with something that, I assume that was the last question.
That's the last one I had. Well then.
Oh, okay, perfect. So I'm translating the testimonies, so let me tell you the real story about poetry. There's a wonderful friend who was in the city of Kyiv this spring when Kyiv was really heavily bombed. She was hiding in the subway along with hundreds of other people hiding in subways, the whole families, for weeks. And so she was trying to write poems from memory. She's a translator and a poet. And she was writing them down in her notebook. And, there's only as many poems as you remember, but you're sitting there for days, literally. So she began to translate them. And she was sitting there in a corner, and little kids came around. They were bored, they're there for days in the subway. There are only as many games as you can play. And they said, what are you doing? I'm translating poems. Can you read some to us? Can I translate with you together? So she read these poems to them, and they began to read them with her. And for me, when some pretentious person will tell you, does poetry matter? Is poetry matter? These questions don't matter. He is a human being in a subway when the city is literally bombed, reciting poetry, and the kids around her begin to do the same, and the life continues. I don't need any other answer. That's good enough for me.
few questions.
So, several, or in two tomes, you have the simile, the body of a boy is exactly like the body of a boy. And then there are other lines where you will be like, or the speaker will use the word, etc. I'm wondering, this is kind of the twofold question, but in the simile, so you said your main poetic device is image, right? Image. Is the sentence, or the simile, the body of a boy is like a body of a boy, is that any sort of claim on similes' inability, or image's inability to articulate?
Excellent question. Thank you for asking it. It would be useful to unpack a little bit because you just repeated, I believe twice, maybe 3 times, but I believe twice. No, 3 times. But the first time it is a simile. And the other 2 times it's a refusal of it. And there are times in life when poetry doesn't do it. When a poet needs to be anti-poet. You familiar with Nicanor Parra?
With who?
Nicanor Parra, a wonderful anti-poet, Spanish language from Chile. But there are so many others. The negative theology, really. When the argument with God is praise of God, so forth. In many different arts, there is this kind of the oppositional, right, being confirming. So, how do you say that metaphor is not good enough and make it useful? How do you say when a child dies, making beauty out of it is not going to work out? My response to it was, okay, I have to fill the room entirely up to the brim with pretty, meaning simile, metaphor, image, and at the moment when I say this, it has to deny the pretty. Then it's going to be useful and memorable, actually say something. Otherwise, it is just another literary device. And literary devices are bread and butter, but they got to answer impossible questions. Otherwise, they're just like decorations on a tree.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Other complaints? Hi.
Yeah, hi. My question is about the way you perform your poetry, because it seems, I mean, I could be wrong, but the first time I encountered this sort of incantatory, almost sort of singing of poetry was when I was a junior in college and was in Leningrad, and my friends all took me to a lot of poetry readings, and it was very different to my ear than the way American poets read their poetry. I mean, there's rhythm to it, and there's a performatory style that I feel is kind of specific to maybe that part of the world, and that seems to be the way you read it, and it's mesmerizing. So, but can you explain, because you've been in the United States to a certain extent and know that people read poetry not that way, not necessarily singing it to their audience in the way that you do. So, what are your choices in
Thank you for this question. I think it would be useful to unpack a little bit. Thank you. I try to resist this kind of exotic Eastern European kind of thing, simply because all cultures have their interest in dance. If you listen to Yeats on tape, he's pretty good. If you listen to Kaminsky, he's pretty weird, but in a productive way, and so forth. Plus, it's quite magnetic, and I can go on. Gwendolyn Brooks' Sweden was one of the most dramatic ones in my life, partly because of how she used it quiet, how she really articulated it, and so forth. I can go on. Speaking about Eastern Europe, well, let me speak not about Russia or Ukraine. Let me speak about, say, Lithuania, a country from Eastern Europe that people should speak about. There is Russian studies. Why there's no Lithuanian studies? Let's have some Lithuanian studies for a moment. It is the last country in Europe to stop being pagan. Nobody talks about it, right? But it's an interesting, it makes you think, oh, the shamanism and all that is not so far from the vision, because, Lithuania got neighbors, right? And what is that? And what does it mean? And what does it mean in terms of poetry? And I'm going to try to keep driving the crafts, the literary devices. So let's take a literary device. Let's take repetition. What does it have to do with the roots of poetry, with shamanism? Let's go, for example, very far from where I come from. Let's go to the continent of Africa. And we're going to go to anthropology, Anthropology 101. Took a class once. Remember what the professor said. This is what professor said. Once upon a time, we were a small group of people gathered around campfire. We learned how to make fire. We haven't quite figured out the language fully yet. One can say we still haven't figured it out, but okay. So there is a shaman, the leader of a tribe, the president of a tribe. The shaman says, fire, 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 until he drops. And everybody is like, what just happened, right? And what happened is, it was one of those early instances, I'm not making it up, it's anthropology. One of those early instances when language was used for more than just information. But if you think about it, it's basic bread and butter of poetry, a literary device called repetition. And we have hundreds of those. Metaphors, alliteration, alternatives, they all come from rituals. There are many books on the subject. I'm talking very basic things, forgive me. But those things take a long time to die. The capitalism is really wanting it to die quicker than it does. But it takes its time. So it's still around. But I can take a very different approach to it, not this exotic Eastern European, but honest. So I read with an accent, meaning I must have a handout. Because I write narrative poetry, it takes a long time to write a novel in verse. So it's going to be another 10 years before I do something else. I'm stuck with this handout. Meaning after I do this kind of thing 5-7 times, I'm really bored. So and you can see I have a short attention span. So you can see how one wants to be creative. One doesn't want to be a traveling salesman selling books. The books are for sale over there. But you see my point, right? Meaning you try to keep being a writer, you're stuck with the goddamn handout. What can you do? You can change syntax, you can change intonation, you can change line breaks, you can change space. I can go on. Meaning you can still be a poet with your voice. Nobody told you that you stop composing because it's time to sell books. You still are having fun. You're alive. And as long as you do that, you really are human. You don't have to be a shaman. You have to be fully present. Otherwise, why bother? Who needs it? It's not a chemistry lecture. Does that answer your question? It would be too easy to say, I come from tradition. I'm a very secular person. Jerry Stern gave amazing readings that sounded like a rabbi. When Joseph Brasty gave reading, Adam Zagayevsky said, he reads like a rabbi on the top of locomotive. Probably did. A great poet, both of them, right?
I was thinking of him when I was
Sure, he was a rock star when I was growing up. Of course I'm influenced by him. Super rock star. At the same time, life goes on. He died 30 years ago. I don't want to be a copy machine. Does that answer your question?
We have time for one. Can you talk a little bit about the process of writing for you? How you come to the page, and if you go back and revise, and this was a 10-year project, how did that process?
Thank you for this question. Appreciate it. The process of writing begins with the process of reading. Otherwise, what is the point? The process of reading begins with the process of writing in your books. I hope there are no librarians in the room. I'll get in trouble. Forgive me. But you have to write in your books. If you don't write in your books as a writer, your books are dead, they're not alive. My wife hates this idea because we end up having 5 books by the same writer, the same title in the house. Because you read this book in the 90s, and you read it in 2004, and you read it in 2014, time to read it again. And you write, so you try to take different kind of notes. But I find this very useful because your bookshelf becomes your notebook. I don't organize my books in alphabetical order. I mean, why? The different alphabets, should I organize it in the Russian alphabetical order or English alphabetical order? I organize it by poetic devices. So all the metaphors go here, or the music goes there. And of course, I get in giant trouble when it's William Shakespeare, because he got everything. But what do I do in that case? I try to organize the books again and again based on what I'm working on. So Shakespeare goes where I need him to go for this particular poem. You would say, well, that's a lot of shuffling of books good, because then you come to a lot of unexpected books when you forgot about that book, and here it is, and it surprises you, your idea of what you can do. So it's very midrashic that way. You're constantly in conversations. It might be very personal because it's not my native language. I need to have it physically in front of me, the actual language. But that is the beginning. After that, you can collect images, you can collect sounds. It's the question of how you write. I ask people all the time, every time you meet a writer you like, you really want to know, what's your secret? And usually, in my experience, people give 2 answers. They give huge variations on 2 things. Some people write a lot on that card. Other people write little notes and then put them together. But it's not that simple. The best answer I can give is, let's look at sister arts. Let's look at painting and sculpture. So if you're Marc Chagall, before you put a kissing couple over a burning village in a cubist order, you need to know something about cubism. So there is your abstraction. You need to come from Vitebsk. There comes your rabbi in the corner. But you also need to know something about bright red, strange green, pale yellow. So you collect colors, and then you put them on a canvas. So this is for a writer who takes a lot of notes and then puts them on canvas. Or if you're Michelangelo, of course, before you make your David, you have to figure out, is it going to be made out of wood, out of iron, marble is a good idea. What kind of marble? And so forth. But then at the end, once he picks the marble, meaning is he a lyric poet, is he epic poet, is he narrative poet, is he meditative poet, is he pastoral poet? Once he tips the marble, he starts cutting. Because somewhere inside that block of stone is David. So that's an example of a kind of writer who writes a lot, picking that stone, right? Got that stone, 30 pages. Let's make a page and a half out of it. So different kind of process. But all of it, in my experience, need to have a lot of language in your hands, like literally in your hands. Because if you come to an empty page and start writing a poem, you're going to have that famous conversation between Mallarmé and Degas. Mallarmé was a great 19th century poet. Degas was a wonderful painter. Degas writes a letter to Mallarmé saying, "My dear Mallarmé, how do you write? I have so many ideas, but every time I sit down, I don't know what to do." Mallarmé is writing, "My dear Degas, the poems are not made out of ideas, they're made out of words." So a lot of notes, or either the whole finished things that you later edit. I have boxes on my table where I put favorite words or favorite images or favorite. I have many different drafts. That very poem that I quoted from Louis Glick, called Nostos, I'm willing to bet that that used to be 2 poems, and the last 4 lines came later. You know, but that is just my assumption. I'm not Louis Glick. But that is a, you know, it's a composition, because Beethoven didn't just, you know, play some piano, write a moonlight sonata, eat a sandwich. He composed it, composer, out of little snippets of silence and musical units. I hope that answers your question. And of course, you steal. And when you don't know what to do, you read Gerard Manley Hopkins for a couple of hours, and suddenly you got some written. I mean, all of that is, my answer is a very joyful, wonderful activity. Craft, life is like an ocean in which you drown. Craft is like a piece of wood which you clean with one hand to stay above the water. You know, craft is complicated because you want to make the whole ship out of that little piece of wood. But it keeps you to stay above the water.
That's beautiful.
Sure.
Thank you so much.